And joining us now for more is Professor Chuck Freilich, the former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, now Professor of Political Science at Tel Aviv University. And Chuck, great to have you back. Now, as we heard in that report, there is a lot of speculation that Russia is now given some kind of green light to Israel to strike at that Latakia port, despite the proximity of that key Air Force base there. I mean, do you agree with that? But I guess the bigger question is why? What's changed with Russia and its strategy towards Syria?
Well, I think, first of all, there are a couple of things that we have to see if they're true. First of all, was this really an Israeli attack? And assuming that it was, I think it's early to assume that Russia really gave it a green light. Now, considering the proximity and the force of the attack, I would imagine that Israel gave the Russians some immediate forewarning just to make sure that no Russian troops were injured in the attack. But this is going to put the Russians in a difficult position, and I would not be surprised if we see some very strong blowback very quickly.
But why would even strikes like these against Latakia, it looked like Israel was avoiding for a number of years, especially there was an incident involving a Russian intelligence aircraft, supposedly, that was hit by Syrian fire during one of these strikes. So what could have changed with the Russians here?
Well, first of all, it is possible that we reached a coordination and agreement with them on this. The Russians, even though they work very closely with the Iranians in Syria, in the sense that they both intervened to prop up and to save the Assad regime, their interests are not the same. And there is competition between them. And maybe the Russians wanted to take them down or allow us to take them down a couple of notches. And it's also possible that this particular shipment of Iranian weapons, whatever it was a particularly sensitive one that even the Russians agreed should not be allowed to happen. But again, I would be quite cautious in assuming that Russia is going to green light this. You correctly pointed out the case a few years ago when Syrian anti-aircraft fire shot down the Russian aircraft, and the Russians placed the entire blame for the incident on Israel. In no uncertain terms, I would say in rather vicious language.
Right. And of course, as I said before, following that, it was a few years until Israel again started these strikes in Latakia. Chuck, stay with us. We're going to move to what is certainly a related issue here, and that is the 8th round of negotiations aimed at reaching agreement to contain Iran's nuclear program, which concluded a second day of talks in Vienna today. Now, U.S. and European officials are warning that time is running out to revive the 2015 deal in some form or another. Israeli Prime Minister Bennett weighed in today on Iran with comments to Israel radio saying, quote, "We are not the bear who said no, and we are not looking for a fight. In the end, there could be a good deal. Is that likely to happen right now? No, because we need a much stronger stand here. We have a good relationship with the U.S. administration. We will not ask permission to defend ourselves. That is our job." Meanwhile, Iranian officials are suddenly striking a somewhat more positive note. Here's what its foreign minister had to say.
We believe that if the other parties continue this round of the talks with goodwill, achieving a good deal for all sides is possible, and we can reach that goal. And if we see seriousness along with goodwill in the other side over the upcoming rounds, even a quick deal in the near future is possible.
And let's go back to Professor Chuck Freilich. Chuck, we're hearing a change in tone from the Iranians. As I said, striking a somewhat more positive note, saying we'll stay in this round until some kind of deal could be reached. Is this a tactic or a real perhaps change in strategy?
Well, I guess I'm in a cautious mood tonight, and so I would again say that let's wait to see how things play out. But look, we were in a absolute crisis position just a few days ago when all the speculation was that the talks have collapsed and there's no prospects to reach a deal. And that's actually exactly the kind of situation in which negotiations often lead to a breakthrough. When things look absolutely terrible, remember, both sides are playing to their domestic audiences. They're conducting real negotiations. nobody wants to make concessions before the absolute last minute when they have no choice. So is it possible that we bottomed out last week with the failure of the last round, and that now the sides are preparing to take off and to reach an agreement? I think that certainly is a possibility. And the other possibility is that it's positive talk for PR purposes, and the Iranians have no intention of reaching a deal.
Right. Now, let's take a look at Prime Minister Bennett's comments today. Of course, he said similar things in the past, but he was very explicit in saying today, even if there is a deal, we're not bound by it. We're still free to act. I want to get your reaction to that policy, whether you think that's actually the case, if the Biden administration signs off on a deal, and whether you think that would be a wise thing for Israel to do.
Well, I don't think that there's any likelihood that Israel would go and exercise its right its sovereign right to self-defense at this point if a deal was signed now. To do so shortly after a deal was reached would really be an unacceptable slap in the face to the United States. But down the line, if and when we believe that the crunch has come, that Iran is about to cross the threshold and become an actual nuclear power, I personally believe that Israel has no alternative but to act, and do so even though I don't think we can achieve a great deal, not a lot of time. But the alternative is to allow Iran to go nuclear. That's intolerable to my way of thinking. And I think the real objective in those circumstances wouldn't be to, it's not so much to, it's a limited gain of time, but the real objective is a diplomatic one, is to create a situation in which the U.S. and the international community, but American leadership, to finally take effective measures, diplomatic and economic, to force the Iranians to suspend the program.
Right. Well, let's take a look at the Biden administration, because we've been also hearing a tone from them of time is running out. This is a last chance. It's a matter of weeks. We know how much certainly some individuals in the Biden administration really do want to reach a deal or revive a deal. So you do take that as a genuine warning, or again, maybe just as you said earlier about the Iranians, a sort of PR move just to sort of try to pressure Tehran to start making concessions?
Well, I think it's a mixture of everything that you're saying. There's no doubt that the administration very, very much wants to reach a deal. That's their strategic objective. And they've been saying it's a matter of weeks for a good few weeks now, probably a couple of months. And I would imagine that when they say a few weeks now, they're talking some months. So let's say sometime in the first quarter of 2022. Are they saying what they're saying to put some pressure on Iran? Absolutely. It's part of the negotiating tactic. And I think going back to your previous question, the good news is that the prime minister and the new government in general, but they are conducting this whole policy issue and the dialogue with the United States in a cooperative fashion. They're not hiding disagreements, and that's legitimate. It's a critical issue for the state of Israel. But they are doing it as disagreement among friends. And I also think that following, unlike, for example, the way Prime Minister Netanyahu used the issue, I think he intentionally promoted the tensions to build himself up in terms of his domestic political base. But what we've seen now, I also think the defense minister, Mr. Gantz, was in Washington. The head of the Mossad was in Washington. And then the U.S. National Security Advisor, Sullivan, was in Israel last week. And I think there is more understanding at the moment between the two sides.
More understanding, but do you think that's actually moved the Biden administration from some of its positions, that it's had an influence on their thinking on Iran?
Well, I think it has had an influence. Israel has a great deal of experience with Iran, not that the U.S. doesn't, but we've got a great deal. We've got unique expertise, specialization in this field. And I think in any event, American policymakers recognize that Israel has what to contribute. in terms of strategic thinking here about Iran. And mostly, actually, Iranian rejectionism, or the surprisingly hardline position that they took in the last talks, where in essence they had walked back all of the concessions that they've made over the last half year. That was a wake-up call for the U.S. administration, even without whatever Israel was saying. So together, yeah, I think it's had an impression on.
Right, and maybe I'll just add also voices from, for example, the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. They may have also had an impact on the Biden administration on its Iran policy. Professor Chuck Freilich, thank you for joining us on The Rundown.